It was a scorching afternoon in the historic city of Savannah. The sun blazed down from an almost cloudless sky, casting a relentless heat. Over Maple Avenue, a street that usually carried a calming rhythm of life. Yet, today, the air felt thick, heavy, as if the street itself was holding its breath. The usual buzz of chatter from pedestrians, the occasional honking of car horns, and the distant murmur of conversations seemed far away. On Maple Avenue, everything felt just a little out of place except for one young man who walked with a sense of quiet purpose through the afternoon haze. Jonathan Harrington, dressed in a simple white t-shirt and faded jeans, was taking the long route home from his part-time job at a nearby CAF. At just 18, Jonathan had grown used to the simplicity of his life. He didn't care for extravagance or attention. Unlike many of his peers who flaunted their wealth and status, Jonathan preferred to remain out of the spotlight. He had been raised in privilege after all. His father was none other than Senator Jim Harrington, a man with immense power and influence over the state of Georgia. But Jonathan never let his last name define who he was. To him, a simple life away from the political limelight felt more authentic, more comfortable. Today, however, was different. As Jonathan walked down Maple Avenue, lost in his own thoughts, he couldn't help but appreciate the moment of peace after a long day of work. The CAF had been busy, and Jonathan had spent hours behind the counter, making drinks, taking orders, and engaging in light conversations with the regulars. Now he could breathe. The noise of the CAF, the clinking of cups, the bustle of the crowd, he had traded it for the sound of his own footsteps on the sidewalk. Jonathan took a deep breath, enjoying the fleeting moments of solitude. His mind wandered to thoughts of his childhood, his family, the pressure of living up to his father's name, and the constant shadow of public expectation. But despite the weight of it all, Jonathan was content with his life. He didn't need the fame, the attention, or the wealth. He just wanted to be Jonathan, a young man with hopes, dreams, and aspirations, not a walking symbol of his father's power. But as he neared the quieter part of Maple Avenue, where the trees shaded the sidewalks, and the streetlights had started to flicker, something caught his attention. A patrol car, its siren flashing briefly, came to a halt right beside him. Jonathan's footsteps faltered for just a second as the car's engine hummed loudly in the otherwise peaceful air. The door swung open, and out stepped Officer William Parker. Officer Parker was a man who had earned a notorious reputation on the force. He had been a cop for over 15 years, but rather than earning respect, he had built a name for himself with his arrogant, bullying attitude and a tendency to see the world through a very narrow and prejudiced lens. He wasn't the kind of cop who served with fairness or integrity, was the kind who sought to dominate, to assert power where it wasn't necessary, to make sure that anyone who crossed his path knew who was in control. And to Officer Parker, Jonathan Harrington, despite his polite demeanor and modest appearance, was just another suspicious figure in a neighborhood he didn't belong. "Hey, you!" Officer Parker barked, his voice cutting through the air. His boots hit the pavement with an audible thud as he strode towards Jonathan. His uniform was pressed, and his badge glinted in the sunlight, but his expression was cold, almost hostile. Jonathan was taken aback by the officer's sudden appearance and the sharpness in his voice. He had seen Officer Parker around before, but never in such close quarters. The officer's eyes swept over him, sizing him up as if Jonathan was somehow out of place. His heart skipped a beat, a wave of unease washing over him. He didn't know why this was happening. He had done nothing wrong. "Yes, officer," Jonathan responded, his voice calm but filled with confusion. "Is there a problem?" "Yeah, there is," Parker shot back, narrowing his eyes. "What are you doing here, kid?" The officer's gaze swept over him, lingering on his clothes, his posture, as if looking for anything justify his suspicion. Jonathan was caught off guard. "I'm just walking home," he replied, his voice steady. "I live just a few blocks away." But Officer Parker wasn't buying it. To him, Jonathan's presence here was enough to make him suspicious. He didn't know the young man, and in his mind, that was all it took. Parker's eyes narrowed further. "I don't see you around here often. What makes you think you can just stroll through like you belong?" Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. He had no idea what the officer was implying. He was just walking home. Why was this happening? He tried to stay calm, I'm just trying to get home, officer, Jonathan repeated. I'm not causing any trouble. Parker ignored the explanation. His eyes hardened as he stepped closer, his voice now tinged with authority. Let me see some ID. Jonathan hesitated for a moment. The whole situation felt wrong, but he knew there was no point in arguing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license. He hoped this would put an end to the unnecessary confrontation. But when Officer Parker looked at the ID, his eyes barely registered the name. He saw Jonathan Harrington, but the name didn't mean anything to him. To Parker, Jonathan was just another kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. He tossed the ID back at Jonathan with a dismissive gesture. This could be fake, Parker muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Empty your pockets. Jonathan felt a surge of frustration, his confusion now turning into anger. Officer, I haven't broken any laws, he said, his voice tight. What exactly is going on here? Parker's expression grew colder. Watch your tone, boy, he snapped. I'm the law here. You'll do as I say. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. He wasn't about to give this officer an excuse to escalate things. He had done nothing wrong. I'm not causing any trouble, he said quietly, trying to remain calm. Can I go now? But Parker wasn't ready to let him go. He grabbed Jonathan's arm, his grip like a vice. You're not going anywhere until I say so. Jonathan flinched at the rough touch, but he didn't resist. He knew better than to escalate things further. A small crowd had started to gather, people whispering among themselves, some even pulling out their phones to record the altercation. Just when things seemed on the verge of spiraling out of control, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a tall, dignified man stepped out in a sharp suit. The crowd fell silent, their eyes widening in recognition. It was none other than Senator Jim Harrington, Jonathan's father. Officer, I believe you have my son there. Senator Harrington's voice rang out, calm but firm. The effect was immediate. Officer Parker's grip on Jonathan loosened, and the officer froze in place. He looked between Jonathan and the senator, a wave of realization washing over him. His arrogance faltered as the power of Jonathan's father became clear. The crowd held its collective breath, as if the entire street had paused to witness this moment. Jonathan's pulse slowed slightly. The tension he had felt in the air suddenly began to dissipate, replaced by the presence of his father, a figure of authority in his own right. But there was still a lingering frustration in Jonathan's chest. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. Senator Harrington stepped closer to the officer, his gaze unwavering. Officer Parker, did you know this was my son? He asked, his tone firm but controlled. Or did you simply not care? Parker shifted uncomfortably, his bravado slipping. I didn't realize, sir, he muttered, taking a small step back. Jonathan stood quietly beside his father, feeling the weight of the moment. He was glad his father was there, but it didn't change the fact that he had been treated unfairly. It didn't change the hurt that had settled in his chest. He had been harassed simply because of how he looked, because of who he was, not what he was doing. Senator Harrington's eyes narrowed. You didn't realize what, officer? That my son is a person, that he deserves the same respect as anyone else? His voice grew colder with each word. You didn't care, did you? Parker's face flushed with embarrassment. He struggled to find a response, his earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of the senator's words. I was just doing my job, sir, he muttered, trying to justify his actions. But Jonathan's father wasn't having it. Doing your job, he repeated. Tell me. Officer, how exactly is harassing a young man simply because he doesn't fit your narrow view of who belongs in certain areas doing your job? Before Parker could respond, another patrol car arrived, this one driven by Officer Davis. He had heard the radio call and came to defuse the situation. He stepped out of the car, his demeanor more professional, less confrontational than Officer Parker's. Is everything okay here? Officer Davis asked, his tone more neutral than Parker's. Senator Harrington gave a curt nod. Everything's fine now, he said, his gaze never leaving Officer Parker. But I expect a full investigation into this. Officer Davis gave a nod, understanding the seriousness of the situation. William, I think it's best if you head back to the station, he suggested. Officer Parker's face burned with shame, his pride now crushed. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, knowing the weight of his actions could not be easily undone. Jonathan and his father watched him leave, the tension in the air still thick despite the officer's retreat. Senator Harrington turned to his son, his voice softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his hand resting gently on Jonathan's shoulder. Jonathan nodded, though his expression was clouded with sadness. "I'm fine, Dad," he whispered. "But I don't get it. Why does this keep happening? Why do they treat me like this?" His father sighed deeply, his expression growing more somber. "I wish I could protect you from this, son. But sometimes, even I can't." Jonathan glanced down at the pavement, trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't angry at his father. He understood the constraints of power and influence, the way the world worked. But that didn't make it easier. The situation would spark a series of news stories over the next few days. Media outlets ran the footage, and the story spread across social media. The police department came under fire for Parker's actions. The city of Savannah, long proud of its southern charm and hospitality, now had to confront its ugly truths. In the days that followed, Officer Parker found himself the subject of internal investigations. His past actions just small mistakes, the shortcuts, and now this caught up with him. His career, once solid and seemingly untouchable, was now on shaky ground. The reputation he had carefully crafted over years was crumbling. As for Jonathan, he didn't find satisfaction in the public outcry that followed. The incident had become a symbol of systemic issues that went beyond one officer's mistake. It was about more than just him. It was about how society treated people who didn't fit the mold. How bias could seep into the smallest interactions and shape lives without anyone noticing. Jonathan's life would move on, but the shadow of that momentous moment, when he realized that power and prejudice could change the way people saw him, would linger with him forever. The lesson? Even the smallest of mistakes can have lasting consequences, and sometimes a single encounter changes everything.